Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, Kweisi Mfume, former Baltimore councilman, U.S. congressman, NAACP president, wants to be Senator Mfume. He'll tell us why. Is moral certainty necessary for a church to have an impact on public policy? We ask Bishop John Chane of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. Gotta love it. A company sues its attorneys for leading it down the illegal path of union busting. Just the sort of case that excites Kim Freeman of the group ARAW, American Rights at Work. Plus, at the National Building Museum, a Dutch architect's guide to maximizing both public amenities and novel affordable housing. We've got the Brazilian sounds of Do Maracatu, and JaHipster discovers she's a shape-shifting superwoman.
Welcome to the Forum at the Coffee House. As you move up the food chain in politics, your opportunities grow leaner. Take the difference between the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate. House seats are open every 2 years, and there are 435 of them, 436 counting D.C.s. But Senate seats are 6 years, and there are only 2 of them per state, and it's famously difficult to unseat an incumbent. So when 5-term Maryland Democrat Paul Sarbanes announced he would not seek re-election next year, aspiring senators presented a rare opportunity. Congressman Ben Cardin from the Baltimore area has tossed his hat in the ring, and Chris Van Hollen from the D.C. suburbs is busy testing waters too. But the first major candidate out of the gate is ours today, and his story sets him apart. Kweisi Mfume was a high school dropout, a gang member, and a street hustler in Baltimore. By the time he was 22, he was the father of 5 children born out of wedlock and heading nowhere but down. And then he turned it all around. He went on to graduate magna cum laude from Morgan State University, earn a master's degree from Johns Hopkins, work as a radio commentator and a TV personality, serve on the Baltimore City Council, and then get elected 5 times to the U.S. House of Representatives. He resigned from the House in 1996 to become president and CEO of the NAACP, a position he held until this year. He's 56 years old. Welcome to the Coffee House.
Remind me again.
I'm right there.
Thanks for the opportunity, Mark. I appreciate it.
Why do you want to be a senator?
Well, I first got bitten by this bug the year that Hubert Humphrey ran and lost. And politics was so foreign
Ran for
to me.
president? Or
Ran for president.
Yeah.
I just happened to hear him. I mean, and he said things that I hadn't heard coming from the mouths of a lot of people, and I got really inspired about this idea of politics. And that year, as a very, very young man, didn't know what to do. I went into a campaign office that said, here, take these bumper stickers and go throughout the community. And so all that summer, that's what I did, believing that this was a different kind of person, saying something that was very different. And so
which is kind of surprising because he was seen as the bearer of the LBJ tradition, which most young people at the time were rejecting.
Yeah, well, it resonated with me. And I mean, the way he spoke about people and the rights of individuals and the need to pull together and to create a society of harmony and one of growth, even at that age, I just hadn't heard it before. So when he lost, I was crushed. And I remember sitting on a curb that night with bumper stickers in my hand, I'm unable to come to grips with the fact that he wasn't going to be the next president. And so I kind of gotten away from politics for a couple of years, but I couldn't get away from what I felt as a result of what I heard. And eventually, as all has been said, many years later, I would run for the city council, get elected by the closest margin in the state's history, 3 votes.
Let me ask you a question. That is close. When you started your career as a radio commentator, which preceded your running for the Baltimore City Council, right?
I have to go back a little bit. Yes, it did. It happened before I ran for the council, yeah.
Did you have in mind at the time the possibility of entering politics?
No. We were working to get a college station on the air. I was a senior.
And it's on the air to this day?
It's on the air to this day, thank goodness.
Good jazz station?
Yeah. So no, I wasn't thinking about that. In fact, after I got the station on the air, I started volunteering in other campaigns and worked in the campaigns of several people who have long since served in the state legislature. But it was that year of 1979 when something came over me and I realized that I thought I could do a better job than the guy that was there representing me, which is always how this starts. Mm-hmm. And I pulled together a few of my friends that had gone to college with. We ran an entire campaign in that day on $10,000, but we knocked on 20,000 homes in the district and overcame a lot. And as I said, ended up winning by 3 votes, which is still, I think, the closest election in the state of Maryland.
That's amazing. You, in running for Senate, you currently have Ben Cardin you're running against, possibly Chris Van Hollen. Tell me how you differ from them, if at all, in terms of your approach.
Well, first I should tell you that Ben and I are very dear friends. We first got elected in '86 and have traveled the world together, and just a great deal of respect for Ben, who I've always referred to as my buddy, and he does the same thing. Chris, I've learned to know and appreciate. He's really got a good sense of humor, and we've been bumping into each other on the campaign trail, and I'm hoping he gets in. I don't know if he will or not, but he's a good guy. And
you want him to enter the race?
The more the merrier for me.
Uh-huh.
I try to count, and I figure if there are 20 people running, then clearly my chances probably go up as opposed to 1. But having said that, I think that what you're going to find between Congressman Van Hollen, Congressman Cardin, and former Congressman Mfume is that we're all pretty close on issues. There's some variances, and so some of us are painted, like myself, more liberal. I don't know what that means at the end of the day. I do know that I believe there's got to be principled, independent leadership in the Senate. Leadership that's not worried about the next election. Leadership that's not afraid to speak truth to power. Leadership that tries to bring people together. And leadership that's going to go around this state, look people in the eye, and let them feel you in the gut, and talk about why you think that the best days for this nation are still ahead, but why you think it's going to take a great deal of effort by all of us to do that. Somebody's going to do that more effectively than the other, and that's going to really define, I think, in the minds of voters who they want, who they trust, who they like, who they believe in. And I've always believed in voters. So no matter what they do, I think we've got to accept the fact that they did what they thought was the right thing. I'm hoping that I'm the right thing in their mind 16 months from now when this election takes place. But I think that more than anything else, we've got to bear ourselves, be open to the questions, and have a rigorous debate of the issues.
Donna Brazile, who was Al Gore's campaign manager in 2000, said that this campaign is kind of a test to see if Democrats are really serious about when they have a highly qualified African American who seeks a seat like the U.S. Senate, like you are, that this is really a test of the Democratic Party's commitment to true equal opportunity. What do you make of that? Is that a fair thing to say?
I guess it's fair if you're making the statement. I don't know if it's a test. I do know that what happens in this state will be kind of looked at nationally. I've always thought Maryland was a barometer state, much more than just a blue state, but a state that kind of is indicative of in many instances, where a lot of real Americans are. So I don't know. I think people are watching, and we will see what happens. The Democratic Party is the party I signed up for when I could, which was 21 in those days. You couldn't. This was before the amendment has passed, and it was blasphemy. My grandmother said, "My God, come talk to this child. He signed up as a Democrat," because she was part of the party of Lincoln, the Emancipation Party. I was always taught in the party as I was taught in my home as a child, which I got away from in those early or late years of my adolescence, and thanks God I came back. But I was taught to work hard, play by the rules, love your country, cherish your faith, respect your elderly, and through the simple eloquence of your example and hard work, try to make the world better. That was my credo. That was what I lived by. And so the Democratic Party for me was a way to embrace that. And I hope the party embraces in a real way those who have been true to it. But I don't want any special favors from the party. I think we ought to say that up front, because then it loses legitimacy, I think.
Good point. I mean, we're 16 months away from the election, but they're already taking polls, and these polls are just for political junkies at this point. But that in a field of 3 of you, Cardin, and Van Hollen, you win that primary, but you don't run as well in the general election against the presumptive Republican candidate, the Lieutenant Governor Steele. In a one-on-one matchup, Ben Cardin runs better. What do you make of that? And should people take that into consideration if the most important thing to them is securing Paul Sarbanes' seat for the Democratic Party? even if it means not getting their favorite candidate, how should they vote?
Well, polls, poppycock. I have never in my life looked at a poll, because every time I looked at one, they said you aren't going to win. And so, you know, there's snapshots, and you're right, it's for the pundits, and it's to sell some newspapers, but the whole world can change in 16 months. So I urge people, don't even pay attention to that. They've got me running first, I think, with 32%, and then Ben at 26 and Chris at 16.
But who's paying attention?
Right. Touche. And then in the general, I think Ben does 4 percentage points better in this hypothetical poll against, what is his name? Steele, and I'm sorry, he's a good friend. And I do, I think, only 2 percentage points. I don't know if it makes a hell of a difference at all. I just know that this is going to be defined by how we interact with people, what we say, what we believe in, what we're willing to fight for. And I think the last poll, as cliche as it may sound, the last poll is really the one on Election Day. You know, that's the only one that counts.
You got a lot of credit for rescuing or leading the NAACP out of financial turmoil, out of a very difficult time politically, and securing it financially and actually opening it up to the hip-hop generation. How did that sit with the older demographic that you inherited?
I think I probably made a few enemies. I was moving in a direction that maybe made a few people uncomfortable. By and large, I had good support from most of my board members, but I mean, in all honesty, when you go to make an omelet and you do break a few eggs and you're talking about doing something new and reaching out to a new generation and trying to redefine within contemporary times the mission of the organization, it's going to make some people uncomfortable. So that happened. I signed up for 5 years when I gave up my seat in the Congress to do that. I ended up doing it for 9 years, on the road 120 days a year, making 65 trips a year, trying to develop within the thinking of a newer generation, a younger generation, a belief that this is not your mother's or your father's NAACP, it's yours. And these are not our times, these are yours, and you have a responsibility to develop. And we created 110 college chapters from Harvard to Yale to Princeton, through all the historically black colleges and universities. We created a notion that it was all right to reach out for the hip-hop generation. We had an outreach into prisons for 18 to 25-year-olds, while at the same time trying to say to everybody else, it's okay, we're not throwing the organization away, we really are trying to reshape it and remake it.
People are now questioning whether you left there under pressure. There was a report issued suggesting that the organization couldn't persuasively defend itself against allegations that you, on behalf of yourself and your son, had promoted women with whom you were romantically attached.
Yeah, I appreciate all the credit, but I'm Superman, and I saw that and we reacted to it. And there are a couple of things. The first thing is that I've always believed, and I've said in every speech I've made for 25 or 26 years, women deserve equal work for equal pay. That shouldn't be a concept or notion that starts with me. Every business and every organization ought to have that as a goal. I've said over and over again that I find it reprehensible that too many women in our society are judged by this sort of floating assumption that they got to where they are in life because of their bodies instead of because of their brains. It's despicable. And I think it is also disheartening that if someone gets mad at you in this day and age, they can toss an innuendo, put out a whisper, hurl an accusation, and then you have to defend yourself. And at the end of the day, you say, okay, I've won. How do I get my good name back? We live in a different era and a different time, and I think regrettably sometimes people do that recognizing that there might be a payoff later on, and organizations do everything they can, business, nonprofit or profit, to try to stay away from that. And so there are too many instances where they're quick to say, but it's what we live in.
We don't have much time left, so I want to run through a bunch of issues with you that you would face as a United States Senator. And I'm not so much interested in how you think about these issues. I think we'll know how you think about these issues. I want to know how important they are to you. Are these issues you're going to lead on as a senator, sponsor legislation, or are these issues that you'll vote the right way on?
Okay. This is a test, right?
This is a test, right. Minimum wage, increasing the minimum
Very
wage.
important. But not just a minimum wage, we need a livable
You
wage
get
for
20 seconds on
individuals in
this.
this country.
Right.
So the minimum wage, I mean, is what we hear about, but working class families and workers in this society need a livable wage where they are not making just a scant income and barely existing, but where they can in fact do the things that you expect to do by working a job and giving the best that you have.
Addressing the spread of HIV.
Oh, it's very significant. And not just in terms of minority communities or gay communities. It ought to be significant within the nation. It's at it's proportions that we've never seen before. We talk about the end result, which is full-blown AIDS, but we ought to talk more and research more and I think work more to deal with this early stages of HIV. And I just, I was disheartened when I heard President Chane make this fleeting reference to, oh, what is that? Or we're doing something with it, as if he didn't know. It affects all of us in this society. We have to have ownership of it, and it's extremely important to me.
Fighting global warming.
Global warming? It's important, but maybe a step down on the pole of things that are important. Vice President Gore and all that he tried to lead in terms of getting people to think about that is significant. It's, I don't want to say long-term in the sense that it's far off, but because it's occurring today, what we do in terms of what we put into the atmosphere and how that causes a breakdown and the shifting of things as we know it. But I would not put it at the same level as the other two issues that we just talked about.
Many thanks to Kweisi Mfume for visiting us in the coffee house. The elections are not until next year, and the Democratic field may well grow, much to your liking, before it shrinks. We'll hear from other candidates over the coming months. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
Hey, Mark, thank you.
Hey, y'all, I have superpowers. Faster than lazy welfare house pros, more powerful than non-voting neopolitical Negroes, able to relate to unsuspecting white folk in a single conversation. I am Superwoman. By day, a mild-mannered exception to that rule, but once on city streets, I blend into urban blocks like that mailbox. 13-year coworkers from the next cubicle can't see me. Invisible. But now I'm also telekinetic. Hey, in my human form, I can't so much as move a school board to buy school books for school children. But after 6 o'clock, I can move the crowds of innocent old white ladies down the block and across the street at inhuman speeds with a single glance. I am that beast. Now, my powers did not manifest until later in life. As a child, acceptable. Afro puffs, adorable. But then the mutant genes kicked in. Hips grew to superhuman proportions, butt enlarged to national security threat. Hair grew in so nappy, it was supernatural. But now, get this. I am also a shapeshifter. I can walk into a convenience store, 6'9", black as night, bald as day, weighing in at a whopping 400 and something or other pounds, and then leave, and by the time the cops catch me, I'm under 5 feet, light-skinned with an afro, weighing less than 92 pounds, wet. Out of my homeworld, where I was just an ordinary princess, my powers grew beyond imagination, and I vowed to save my adopted homeworld from the horrors of whatever, so that they would love me like Superman. But instead, they treat me more like the Wonder Twins. Pointless, powerless, and wondering why they ever brought me on the show in the first place.
Welcome to the Willing Spirit at the Coffee House. The recent election of Pope Benedict XVI has occasioned a fascinating public discussion about what it takes to be an effective moral leader in the 21st century. Long known for his emphasis on the unchanging truths upon which the Roman Catholic Church is built, Pope Benedict has already found several opportunities to warn the Church and the world against the dangers of moral relativism. My guest is a religious leader who takes a different approach when it comes to speaking about moral issues of public concern, which he does often. The Right Reverend John Chane is the Bishop of the Washington Diocese of the Episcopal Church. In the 3 years since his installation, Bishop Chane has spoken out forcefully on a number of issues, from the war in Iraq to global warming to the blessing of same-sex partnerships. He has done so, however, with awareness that his church cannot offer a single unified verdict on any of these moral issues. Bishop Chane, welcome to the Coffee House.
Thanks. Good to be here this evening.
So, where do you stand on the question of moral certainty and moral relativism? Do you think that moral certainty is something that is a requirement for anyone who is going to speak out on issues of moral concern in the public arena?
I kind of get very concerned when we start talking about moral certainty. I know that when I speak out, I don't speak for the church, I speak to the church. And there's a very different way of looking at things when you live that way and when you see your role as being the one who speaks to rather than speaking for it.
And do you only speak to the church, or do you at times also want to speak to the community as a whole?
Well, you'd like to speak to the community. You would hope the community would listen, and I think on occasion they do. But my responsibility primarily as the Bishop of Washington is to address the issues that are both domestic and global for the people that I serve in 93 congregations and in the 4 counties of Maryland and in the district.
And are those things that you do are those things that you speak about with certainty?
I speak about them with some authority, I think. Yeah, it's certainty in terms of where they are for me as a human being and as a Christian.
And yet the diocese is a very diverse one, and as is the American Episcopal Church.
Yeah, we're hugely diverse. I mean, we're one of the most diverse dioceses in the country. We have more African Americans ordained and serving in this diocese than in any other diocese. We're an entry point for Africans, especially West and Central Africans, to the United States. We have more women who serve as rectors in congregations than I think most any other diocese in the country.
And with that, I know at least with that international diversity in the church, I'm sure there's theological and cultural differences as well. How has that affected your ability to take stands on some of the issues that you've spoken out on so forcefully?
Well, I think it's important for people to hear, first of all, where they elected me as their bishop, and they pretty much knew what they were going to get when they elected me, because I had no idea I would be elected as the Bishop of Washington. So I was very clear during the time prior to election when we walked around the diocese and met with folks where I would be on issues of gay rights, civil rights, the issue of what at that time was a very volatile Middle East. We hadn't really thought too much about war with Iraq, although I think that was being planned during this time of walking about and discussing it. So people knew pretty much what they were going to get. So I think it's been very easy for me to speak out on issues that are controversial because in a sense I don't owe anybody anything, and came into the election with that in mind.
So you're sure where you stand on those issues, and yet here you are in this diocese that there's clearly a wide diversity of viewpoints, and that diversity has certainly been spotlighted in the recent years, especially around the issue of the blessing of same-sex unions. Sure. And the consecration of the first openly gay Episcopal Bishop, Gene Robinson, in New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. And so how have you managed to balance that tension between being sure yourself on some of these issues and wanting to be very vocal and out in what your feelings are, and yet knowing that there's going to be people who disagree with you, and those are people not only who you debate with, but people who you are part of, do church with.
I've always believed that disagreement does not mean communication is ended. So for those who would disagree with me, I really focus on respectful disagreement. I work real hard at it. I spend a lot of time at it, working with people who don't agree with me, and also those who have very, very strong opinions about a variety of issues. And it's to their credit, I think, that we've been able to live together quite well, respecting each other's differences and trying to live within a sense of community.
Respectful disagreement isn't something that we tend to do very well in the public sphere or in political debate here in this country. And I know that especially around some of these moral issues, gay and lesbian unions and so on, the dialogue was incredibly heated in the last debate, in the last election. Have you learned something from your experience of that conversation and that kind of respectful disagreement that you would share with others who are trying to negotiate the same conversation?
I think we do a lot of talking, but I don't think we do a lot of listening. And I think that really kind of defines at least my understanding of the culture that I live in right now. Everybody has a lot to say, and the media enhances that, and that, whatever it is that we have to say, is instantaneously communicated globally within a minute, within a second and a half. And so we all have our agendas, we all have our things that we want to put out. And I'm not sure that we really are willing to listen to people who are very different to us, because we have a high level of commitment to our own agenda. So I think that's one of the great problems in the culture that at least I serve, is that we are not good listeners. We're great talkers.
What does it take to really listen to somebody who you are convinced is completely wrong about an issue?
Value them as a human being and recognize that what they have to say may not be something that I can accept or that I would agree with, but for them it has value, and it motivates their behavior, and it defines in a sense who they are. And I think when we don't do that, when we devalue somebody because of what they have to say, then in fact we demean them as a human being. And it's very easy after that point to get to a place where we not only demean, but we just absolutely try and destroy our opponents so that we hold the upper hand, we have the top card. And you can see it in politics today. You can see it in the way in which the major denominations, in a sense, govern themselves. It sets a very poor example for the gospel, at least, that Christians claim to follow.
You've lost me there. Tell me, how is it that how are the major denominations governing themselves in a way that's setting a poor example?
Well, we continue to internally debate within ourselves as to who is more orthodox, who has the right interpretation of Holy Scripture, who really understands the mystery of human sexuality, who really understands or really has a commitment to the foreign policy of this country, or preemptive war, or whatever the issue is on the table.
And do you wish that, for example, the Episcopal Church could speak with a more unified voice on some of those issues and not debate within itself?
I wish we'd get away from battling over the issues that seem to be picked up by the press as being titillating and exciting. Everybody wants their minute of fame. And unfortunately, the media tends to provide that for many, many people, especially in the religious community. Mm-hmm. And I think we've got to get away from that. Not that we have to get away from the media. We are the problem. We are the problem. We provide all of the resources that you absolutely need to have juicy stories and great conflict. And we really get away from addressing the issues that I think the gospel calls us to address. I mean, Jesus was less concerned about creed and far more concerned about deed. If you look at the life of the early community, if you look at Paul, whenever Paul went into a community to preach or teach, when he left, it was in chaos. Today, when the Episcopal Church enters into a community for some kind of engagement or dialogue, we don't leave it in chaos. We get an invitation to have an iced tea. I mean, we got a problem here.
Bishop Chane, at the end of the day, what are your key certainties?
Well, I think the first thing is that I am ultimately loved by God, that I am a person who has been forgiven by God for all of those things that I continue to do and have done in the past. I am a person who lives on the premise of hopefulness. I don't look at the world and the life of the church right now as a great sad commentary on the ills of human behavior. I look at it as an opportunity that allows us to raise issues that are excruciatingly important for people, put them on the table, get them out on the clothesline so people can, we don't hide our dirty laundry anywhere. I mean, we are the first denomination to say, whether people liked it or not, we are not going to hide behind homosexuality anymore. If we find a candidate who is qualified and is loved by his people and is duly elected as a bishop in this church, by his people in his diocese, and he is in a committed relationship, so be it. We're more concerned about will he love his people and care for his people rather than what does he do in his bedroom after 10 o'clock at night. And I think we've got to get over that craziness. We are so obsessed with it in this country. So being loved, being forgiven, and extremely hopeful for the future of not only Christianity, but also denominationalism, which people have given a bad rap in the last 5 to 10 years.
Well, thanks so much for joining us and for sharing some of your vision about what that kind of conversation, that dialogue between people who hold some of those same commitments, but who disagree about how they may play out, how we can actually stay together in community with one another. Your passion for speaking out with those folks is inspiring to all of us. And we hope that you'll continue to speak loudly and strongly and continue to listen and show us how to do the same.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on The Coffee House. I'm Heather Kirk-Davidoff.
Welcome to the Artistic Eye. This month, we're visiting the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C. This landmark building that started out as the Pension Bureau has become the most popular cultural institution on architecture in the world. The architect Philip Johnson once called it the grandest interior space in the country. Ed Worthy, Vice President of Education, recently invited Nathalie de Vries, a prominent Dutch architect, to lecture about her innovative design projects. We spoke to both of them to talk about her highly acclaimed work and his highly acclaimed museum.
I do know that people subconsciously are affected by design, and they don't realize that. And what we try to do here at the museum, both in our exhibitions, our lectures, as well as our school programs, is to get the people to be more conscious about design and how design affects them, and more importantly, how they can impact and affect design.
I consider architecture as a cultural act. And even though we're not able to control the whole process anymore, you still realize that architecture is bringing together a lot of different things and turning something which is also almost like a commodity or an object into a cultural deed.
There has been a void in Washington area about design, and Washington is an important community for design, but we are a national institution as well. So we look to serving the Washington audiences as well as national audiences. And in fact, we're the only institution in the country, only cultural institution in the country that deals with all disciplines, with construction, engineering, urban planning, and architecture, both the design of buildings and the design of landscapes. So we put all that together along with sort of the social dimensions of all of this, and explore all that through our educational programs as through our exhibitions.
For us, it's always been very important throughout the work, the years that we work together, that we do not only make buildings an object and not only single houses or just elevations even of a house, but we're often able to make an urban design before we start to design the house. And this allows us not only to think about the house itself or the style or the type of house, but we're also allowed to we can also make the environment of the house, the actual neighborhood, you could say, which is vital for the success of the house. I think that in the Chinese project I've shown tonight for Tianjin, in a rapidly growing metropolis, this urban regeneration plan, we pretty much worked with the same aspects as we do in the Dutch schemes, which is including everything on the site, up to the road, the parking, the natural elements that are still there. And of course the amount of houses that have to be made, the type of people that should live there. The thin line that of course everybody's walking on is sort of the line between what is actually improvement of living conditions of people and what is like total erasure of history and of past in this country. What we try to add is some kind of public value and find as much public space as possible, and as much houses of different qualities as possible, offer people choices. So you have to think at the same time about each house individually, strangely enough, and about the sum of it all. And another project we did that was made in Japan, very interesting project because the Japanese government is transferring money to the provinces. The local villagers were a bit worried though, because they thought we wouldn't be able to cope with the natural forces of the environment, which has quite some snow in winter. If we lift up the building, we can at least free the building from all this snow and do not have to make some kind of dark, enclosed, heavy space. But we can make a room with a view, which at the same time is snow-free. Inside, no columns and the paths leading through. In collaboration with different artists, what we asked all artists to do is to think only in one color, so that the building in winter would also act a bit like a lantern. Every building, every project is also a construction that you've first made up in your mind. So the logic of it is first a kind of theoretical construction.
We try to present a variety of points of view so that people can learn from that.
So go see the exhibitions at the museum. My favorite exhibit is liquid stone. Yes, concrete can be exciting. The exhibit is so popular, it has been extended through the end of the year. For the coffee house, I am Welmoed Laanstra.
Welcome to Worklife at the Coffee House. Labor law violations by employers resisting unions aren't exactly unusual. They happen every 23 minutes, according to the group American Rights at Work. Some people call it union busting. But here's a case with a very unusual twist. A South Carolina employer gets cited for more than 100 labor law violations in a 7-year effort to keep out a union. Eventually, the employer has to pay the workers nearly $8 million to settle the case. But now the employer is suing its lawyers for malpractice, saying the company got in trouble with the law because it did what its lawyers told it to do. For more on this extraordinary story, we turn to Kim Freeman, Communications Director for American Rights at Work. Kim, welcome to the Coffee House.
Thank you, Fred.
At this point, I should say that I've done some consulting work for American Rights at Work. So Kim, tell us, what does the company say it was told to do by its lawyers?
Well, I should first start by saying that this is an extraordinary inside look at what happens when workers actually attempt to form unions and their employers are willing to stop at nothing to stop them from doing so. EnerSys claims that its union-busting law firm, Jackson Lewis, advised them to do things like illegally fire up to 7 of its employees, to hire human resources managers to help thwart the union drive, and even to bribe certain members of their employees to actually coerce their fellow employees to get the union out of there.
Well, now the company had to pay almost $8 million to settle this case, so this must be a pretty unusual case.
Well, unusual, yes, in the sense that very rarely does an employer publicly sue their union-busting consultant, which gives the public access to public records that, enable us to see what's usually hidden and obscured from view. Unusual, no, in the sense that many companies like Enersys actually use these union avoidance law firms and other consultants to actually thwart and limit their employees' ability to form unions. In fact, 75% of employers who are faced with a union organizing drive employ consultants like Jackson Lewis to actually help them.
So this is not uncommon for a firm like this to be hired by a company?
Actually not, and unfortunately not. Oftentimes you'll see that 25% of employers, when faced with union organizing drives, actually illegally fire an employee who expresses pro-union sentiments. Over 34% of employers, when faced with a union organizing drive, actually coerce employers with bribes. And over 51% of employers illegally threaten to close down work sites if employers vote to form a union.
So I guess what you're saying is unusual, particularly unusual about this case, is the inside look we get at what actually happened here because of the malpractice suit.
That's very true. That's very true.
Well, was this a particularly inexperienced firm that they hired here, since they're being sued for malpractice?
No, Jackson Lewis is actually one of the largest and oldest law firms that specializes in union avoidance. On their website, they cite the fact that they've done thousands, tens of thousands of workshops for employers to help them avoid unions, and that they've employed attorneys across the country that actually do this kind of work.
Well, what was American Rights at Work, the organization? What was its role in this case?
Well, Fred, usually what we do is we serve as a clearinghouse and collect thousands of examples in our database of examples of what happens to workers when they attempt to form unions. This case, because of its unusual nature, as we talked about, and just in terms of these cases never seeing the light of day, where you have an employer actually confessing to what it's been put up to do by its consultant, we thought that it was important that the public learn about this. So what we did was worked exclusively with a reporter from the New York Times to bring this case to the light of day.
And what happened? You worked with them, and was there an article?
We did. In fact, Stephen Greenhouse did an extensive investigation, piled through thousands and thousands of pages of discovery documents from the case, went down to South Carolina, interviewed the workers, interviewed several people involved with the case, and actually wrote one of the most compelling, expansive exposés on union busting that we've seen in a long time.
So what else does American Rights at Work do? You've described this case in some detail. What are some of the other things you've been up to?
Well, we exist to basically educate the public about the barriers that workers face when they attempt to form unions. And we do that in a number of ways. One, we conduct original research, often in conjunction with independent researchers at universities across the country, to really expose typical employer abuses of workers when they try to exercise their democratic rights. We also attempt to stimulate the debate among policymakers to make sure that, our laws are reformed so that workers are better protected when they're faced against this kind of activity. And we also collect, like I mentioned, stories from workers and from a variety of different other sources. We monitor media to look at examples of cases like this that are brought to the public's attention.
When did American Rights at Work come into being?
We've existed for just about 2 years, and we were founded in 2003 by a number of unions who saw it as an important thing to really have an organization that was dedicated to enlightening the public about this particular issue. As you mentioned, over 23,000 workers every year, that's 23 workers a minute, are fired or suffer discrimination simply for trying to exercise their democratic right. You know, and 30 years ago, when workers represented, when union workers represented over 30% of the workforce, you know, that number only was in the hundreds.
Well, okay, you've got unions out there advocating for unions, and you've got business groups taking a different view. Why do you need another group like American Rights at Work aren't you doing the same thing? Why do you need a new organization?
Well, I don't think that there can ever be too many people who can talk about this issue, actually. We know that over 50% of the American workforce wants unions, but because of practices like union busting, it makes it increasingly difficult for workers to have them. Workers in our country are under attack. And the role of American Rights at Work is to really begin to build a broad base of support among individuals, employers, public interest groups, and all concerned citizens and policymakers who really want to take action not only to protect the workers who have unions, but also to see this issue as a way to preserve our democracy.
So you're reaching out, if I understand what you're saying, to groups that unions don't necessarily have access to, and how do you do that? How do you broaden this message? How do you get this message out to a broader base of people?
I think it begins by the way that we're actually governed. If you look at the composition of our board of directors, we're led by former Michigan Congressman and former Democratic Whip David Bonnier, who served for 26 years in the U.S. House of Representatives. He's joined by several other former members of Congress and current members of Congress, including John Edwards and Congresswoman Hilda Solis. We have people on our board like actor Brad Whitford and people from the civil rights movement like Wade Henderson, who represents the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. So we have a variety of people, including Carl Pope, who runs the Sierra Club, who see this issue as intrinsically linked to other issues that advance social justice, democracy, and fairness.
Well, now, unions represent a decreasing number of workers, and it seems like unions aren't on people's minds these days. Is this message that you're trying to get out, are you a little late? Has the time sort of come and gone for unions, and does ARA really have an audience to get its message out to anymore?
Oh, I think absolutely we do. The assault on workers has become so pervasive. I mean, before I came to the studio, I actually did a query on Google of how many times union avoidance comes up, and it gets over 500,000 hits. So it's a pervasive problem. And I think what we're finding is that when you have 50 million people say that they want unions, and yet you have smaller numbers represented among those who have union membership, you know, it's a problem that needs to be talked about more.
Well, many thanks, Kim Freeman from American Rights at Work, for joining us in the coffee house. Sounds like we're going to be hearing more about the importance of truly protecting a worker's right to organize. And it sounds like we're going to be hearing more about the new organization, American Rights at Work. It's an organization that is insisting we pay attention to the huge obstacles workers routinely face when they try to organize a union. I'm Fred Feinstein, and this has been Worklife.
Welcome, Gilberto and Patricia, to the Coffee House. What was the name of that composition and who wrote it?
That composition is a very famous Brazilian composition. The name is Brasileirinho, which means Little Brazilian. Was composed by a guy named Jacob Bandolim.
How long ago?
That song's from the 50s. It's kind of old song, but it's so popular in Brazil. Everybody knows that song.
We would think of it, if it was an American tune, it would be a jazz standard. It would be in everybody's book, basically.
Yeah, you'll be.
Tell me a little about the pandeiro. That's more than a tambourine.
Okay,
right?
that's a pandeiro. It's a Brazilian version of the tambourine. We don't play like the regular ones like that.
Right.
So we play music.
In American music, the tambourine is oftentimes just somebody banging out in fours because they need to do something with their hand. You know, it's like the lead singer holds it. Obviously, in Brazilian music, it's an art form.
Yeah, in Brazilian music, the whole of the tambourine is one of the most important percussion instruments because you can have all the sounds of the batucada in it. The batucada. The batucada is this. Means a lot of drums playing together.
Thank you. Thank you for translating.
Yeah.
I grew up in New Jersey, you know.
Okay.
Okay.
So you can have the low tones like.
Yeah.
And you can have that kinds, and you can have the jingle sound, and the tambourine has the main beat of the samba, which is like. That thing defines this is samba, and when you listen to that, so you can find out this is samba.
What are you going to take us out with? I want you to play another tune, but what's it called?
We will play another tune it's a kind of baião. Baião is the music from my region of Brazil.
Okay.
And that song is from Quarteto Novo. It was an old group too. Was wrote by Hermeto Pascoal, and it's called O Ovo.
Okay. Take us home.
Thank you.